The night was thick with fog, the kind that clung to Ravenbrook Village like a shroud, muffling sound and swallowing light. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, but beneath it lingered something else, something old and uneasy, like the breath of the forest itself. Thomas Holloway, a broad-shouldered farmer with rough hands and a weary face, had spent the evening at the village tavern. He drank alone, speaking little, his gaze distant. The others left him be. They knew the Holloways had always been a quiet lot. When the last embers of the fire dimmed, Thomas stood, nodded to the barkeep, and stepped out into the mist. No one saw him after that. The next morning, his neighbor, old Mrs. Driscoll, noticed his cattle unfed, their panicked lowing carrying across the fields. She called for him, but the farmhouse stood empty, the door ajar, a cold pot of tea on the table. His boots were still by the hearth, his coat hanging on the peg. It was as if he had simply stepped outside and dissolved into the fog. The villagers gathered, murmuring. Some said they'd heard a sound the night before, not an animal, not the wind, but something between. A few recalled the faint glow beyond the tree line, pale and shifting, like will-o'-the-wisps. But no one spoke too loudly of such things, not in Ravenbrook. Then young Eli Carter, barely 10 years old, whispered what he'd seen. Figures, tall and thin, moving at the edge of the woods. Not walking, gliding. His mother hushed him, but the damage was done. The fear settled in, heavy and familiar. Old man Hargrove, the village elder, stood at the edge of the gathering, his knotted hands gripping his cane. His voice was low, but carried weight. "Best let it lie," he said. "Some things don't take kindly to being chased after." But beneath his words hung the unspoken truth. This had happened before, and it would happen again. The rain came down in slow, heavy drops the night the stranger arrived in Ravenbrook. The village had no inn, no proper lodging for travelers, only the Black Thistle Tavern, a squat timber-framed building with smoke-stained windows and a sign that creaked like a dying man's breath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ale, damp wool, and something older, something like mildew and secrets. The villagers noticed him the moment he stepped through the door. Outsiders were rare in Ravenbrook, and this one carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was tall, wrapped in a long coat that dripped rainwater onto the worn floorboards, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He moved like a man who knew how to step quietly, how to listen more than he spoke. Silence settled over the tavern like a held breath. The usual chatter, talk of crops, of the missing Holloway, of the strange lights in the woods, died in an instant. Even old man Hargrove, hunched in his usual corner, lifted his rheumy eyes to study the newcomer. The stranger approached the bar, where Eli Carter's father, Jeb, stood wiping a glass with a rag that had long since given up pretending to be clean. "Whiskey," the stranger said, his voice low but carrying, "and a room, if you've got one." Jeb set the glass down a little too hard. "No rooms here, only beds are upstairs, and they ain't for rent." The stranger didn't react, just slid a silver coin across the bar. It gleamed under the lamplight, too bright for a place like this. Jeb hesitated, then pocketed the coin. "You can sleep in the loft, straw mattress, no promises on the fleas." The stranger nodded, took his whiskey, and turned to face the room. Every eye was on him, some wary, some outright hostile. He took a slow sip, then said, "I'm looking for Thomas Holloway." A chair scraped. Someone coughed. No one answered. Then from the back, a woman's voice, soft but sharp. "Ain't none of us seen Thomas, not since the mist took him." The stranger turned. It was Martha Holloway, Thomas's sister, her hands clenched around a mug of cider she hadn't touched. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. "Missed?" the stranger echoed. Martha opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Old Man Hargrove cut in. "Ain't nothing but foolish talk. Thomas was a grown man. If he wandered off, that's his business." The stranger studied Hargrove for a long moment, then reached into his coat. The room tensed. Was he reaching for a weapon? But what he pulled out was a small leather notebook. "My name is Elias Vane," he said. "I'm an investigator, and I've heard stories about Ravenbrook." The silence deepened. Then, from the shadows near the hearth, a voice muttered, "Stories ain't always meant to be heard." Elias didn't flinch. "Maybe not, but I think Thomas Holloway heard them too." Just then, the tavern door groaned open, letting in a gust of wet wind. A child stood there, Eli Carter, his clothes soaked, his eyes wide. "Ma," he whispered, though his mother wasn't there. "I saw 'em again, the shadow people. They was watching the tavern." The room erupted. Some cursed, others made warding signs. Martha Holloway stood so fast her chair toppled. Elias Vane set down his whiskey, his gaze fixed on Eli. "Show me," he said. And with that, the outsider stepped into Ravenbrook's nightmare. The Holloway farm stood silent under a bruised twilight sky, the last streaks of sunset bleeding into the horizon like an open wound. Elias Vane picked his way through the overgrown path, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The air smelled of rotting leaves and something metallic, like old blood on the wind. Thomas Holloway's house was a skeleton of what it had once been. The wooden beams sagged under the weight of years, the windows staring out like hollow eyes. The front door swayed slightly on its hinges, creaking as if whispering a warning. Elias hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The interior was frozen in time. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, the bread now green with mold, the stew congealed into a thick sludge. A single chair was overturned, its legs pointing toward the ceiling like a dead animal. Elias righted it, his fingers brushing against deep grooves in the wood. Claw marks, but too large to belong to any natural beast. A lantern still hung by the door, its oil long since burned out. Elias struck a match, the sudden flare of light casting monstrous shadows against the walls. The flame trembled as he moved deeper into the house, his breath coming slow and measured. Upstairs, Thomas's bedroom was in disarray. The sheets were tangled, the pillow torn open, feathers scattered like snow. But it was the journal on the nightstand that caught Elias's eye. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles, the ink smeared in places where the writer's hand had shaken. "They're calling me," one entry read. "Not with words, with whispers in the walls, with dreams that cling like cobwebs. Last night I saw them standing at the foot of my bed, tall and thin, their faces smooth as bone. They don't blink, they don't breathe, they just watch." Elias turned the page. "The others think I'm mad. Hargrove says to ignore it, to pretend I don't hear them. But how can I? They're in the fields now, in the mirrors, in the spaces between the trees. They're waiting for something, for the mist, for the hollow tree." A floorboard groaned behind him. Elias spun, the lantern light swinging wildly. For a heartbeat he thought he saw something, a flicker of movement in the hallway, a shape too tall, too still. Then nothing, just the empty house and the sound of his own pulse in his ears. He exhaled sharply and turned back to the journal. The final entry was a single line, the letters jagged, desperate. "They're coming tonight." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Elias snapped the journal shut and slipped it into his coat. As he descended the stairs, his foot caught on something half buried in the floorboards. A small, carved figurine, its features worn smooth by time. It looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong. The arms too long, the mouth too wide. A chill crawled up his spine. He pocketed the figurine and stepped back into the night. The fog had thickened, curling around the house like grasping fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Elias didn't look back. The Ravenbrook church stood at the edge of the village like a forgotten sentinel, its stone walls blackened by centuries of rain and neglect. The iron gate groaned in protest as Elias Vane pushed it open, the sound cutting through the pre-dawn stillness like a dying man's sigh. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and candle wax gone rancid. Elias had come for answers. The priest, if this decaying place still had one, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the only light came from a single guttering candle atop a warped wooden desk, its flame throwing jagged shadows across shelves bowed under the weight of ancient ledgers. These were not books of prayer, but records, names, dates, and disappearances. Elias ran a finger along the cracked spines until he found what he was looking for. A ledger marked Harvests 1793 to present. The pages crackled as he turned them, brittle as old skin. The entries began normally, crop yields, livestock counts, but then, scattered between the mundane, other words appeared. Gone to the mist. Taken by the watchers. Given to the hollow. Every 30 years, like clockwork. The most recent entry sent a cold needle threading through Elias's veins. Thomas Holloway, called, 14th of October. Beneath it, fresh ink still gleaming. The debt comes due. A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias turned to find old man Hargrove standing in the doorway, his gnarled hands gripping his cane like a weapon. The candlelight carved deep gullies into his face, making his eyes sink back into his skull. "You shouldn't be here," Hargrove said. His voice was the sound of dead leaves scraping stone. Elias held up the ledger. "You knew, all of you knew this would happen." For a long moment, the only sound was the candle sputtering in its pool of wax. Then Hargrove shuffled forward, his joints popping like green wood in a fire. "There's things in these woods older than the stones of this church," he whispered. "Older than God himself. We don't fight 'em. We feed 'em. One every 30 years, and the rest go free." Elias stared at him. "You sacrifice your own people." Hargrove's lips peeled back from yellowed teeth. "We survive." Thomas knew his duty. His grandfather went the same way, and his before him. The Holloways have always been strong stock. Good meat for the watchers. Outside, the wind rose, howling through the church's broken, stained glass. The candle flame guttered wildly, and in that flickering dark, Elias saw it. The truth behind Ravenbrook's silence, behind the way Martha Holloway's hands shook when she spoke her brother's name. This wasn't a village. It was a farm, and the people were the livestock. The village square of Ravenbrook was unnaturally still under the pale glow of the harvest moon. A thick mist curled around the cobblestones, muffling the nervous chatter of the gathered villagers. Elias Vane stood among them, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. The air was charged with tension, a storm waiting to break. Then it happened. Martha Holloway screamed. Elias turned just in time to see young Eli Carter, the boy who had first spoken of the shadow people, suddenly stiffen, his small body going rigid. His eyes widened, his mouth opening in a silent gasp as something unseen gripped him. The villagers recoiled as the air around Eli shimmered, like heat rising off summer asphalt. For a heartbeat, the boy seemed to stretch, his form distorting as if viewed through warped glass. Then, with a sound like a sigh, he was gone. Vanished into empty air. Chaos erupted. Women wailed, men cursed, and children clung to their mothers' skirts. Old Man Hargrove stood apart from the rest, his face ashen but unsurprised. Elias pushed through the crowd to where Eli had stood moments before. The ground was unmarked. No footprints, no sign of struggle. Only a lingering chill in the air, like the breath of an open grave. Then, from the tree line at the edge of the square, a whisper of movement. Elias's gaze snapped up. They were there, tall, emaciated figures, their elongated limbs barely visible in the shifting mist. Their faces were smooth, featureless, reflecting no light, absorbing all of it. Watching, waiting. One of the villagers, a burly farmer named Colum, let out a roar of rage and hurled a stone at the figures. It passed through them as if they were made of smoke. The shadows didn't react. They didn't need to. Elias felt the weight of the ledger in his coat pocket, the words, "The debt comes due," burning in his mind. This wasn't just another disappearance. This was a warning. The forest swallowed Elias whole. Moonlight bled through the skeletal branches overhead as he pushed deeper into the woods, the villagers' torches long extinguished behind him. The air here was different, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood seeping from the roots of the world itself. His breath came in ragged clouds, his fingers brushing against the revolver at his hip, though he knew bullets wouldn't save him from what waited ahead. Then he saw it. The hollow tree. It rose from the forest floor like a gnarled hand clawing its way out of the earth, its trunk split wide open, a yawning maw of splintered wood and darkness. Symbols had been carved into its bark, their edges worn smooth by time, but still pulsing with a faint, sickly luminescence. They weren't just markings. They were words, a plea, a bargain. Elias stepped closer, the ground beneath him crunching unnaturally. Not leaves, but bones. Small ones. Animal at first, then not. A whisper slithered through the branches. Not wind, not language, but something that understood both. Then the chanting began. From the shadows, figures emerged, villagers, their faces hidden beneath tattered hoods, their voices low and rhythmic as they formed a circle around the tree. At their center stood Old Man Hargrove, his gnarled hands raised to the sky, a bundle of cloth cradled against his chest. Something squirmed inside it. Elias's blood turned to ice. The bundle was Eli Carter. The boy's eyes were wide, his mouth gagged, his limbs bound with cords, woven from what looked like human hair. Hargrove's chant rose to a crescendo as he stepped toward the tree's hollow, the other villagers echoing him in a drone that vibrated in Elias's teeth. The tree groaned. Something stirred in the blackness of its hollow, a shifting liquid darkness that peeled itself from the wood like tar given sentience. It reached for Eli with tendrils that were not quite limbs, its form defying the eye, slipping between shapes, a hand, a root, a mouth. Elias moved before he could think. His shout shattered the ritual's rhythm as he lunged forward, knocking Hargrove aside. The old man howled, but Elias barely heard him. The thing in the tree recoiled, not in pain, but in surprise. For the first time in centuries, something had interrupted the feeding. Then the shadows moved, not just from the tree, but from the ground, the air, the villagers' very mouths. They surged toward Elias in a wave of hungry dark. And the tree began to sing. The moment Elias disrupted the ritual, time itself seemed to fracture. The villagers' chanting dissolved into screams as the hollow tree convulsed, its bark splitting further with a sound like tearing flesh. The darkness within pulsed outward, not as tendrils now, but as a flood. A living blackness that swallowed the torchlight and left only cold in its wake. Elias stumbled back, dragging Eli with him, but the ground beneath them had turned to quicksand, pulling them toward the widening maw of the tree. Then, silence, absolute, suffocating. When the darkness receded, Elias found himself not in the woods, but somewhere else, somewhen else. The vision unfolded around him like a rotting tapestry, Ravenbrook, but not the Ravenbrook he knew. This was a younger village, its buildings crude, its people dressed in homespun wool and fear. At its center stood the hollow tree, not ancient yet, but blighted, its leaves curled black with disease. A woman knelt before it, her hands bloodied, her voice raw from screaming. A priest in robes long forgotten by history pressed a knife to her throat. "The land is hungry," he intoned. "The watchers must be fed." The scene shifted. Centuries tumbled past in grotesque snapshots. A child given to the roots in a year of famine, a lover cast into the hollow to cure a plague, a dozen more, 100, their names etched into the tree's flesh like scars. With each offering, the tree grew stronger. The watchers grew bolder. The village prospered. Elias understood now. This was no mere haunting. Ravenbrook had been built on a bargain, not with the devil, but with something older, something that slumbered beneath the soil and fed on suffering. The disappearances weren't accidents. They were payments. And Thomas Holloway? Just the latest receipt in a ledger written in blood. The vision shattered as something gripped Elias from behind. Hargrove's voice hissed in his ear, rancid with desperation. "You see now, outsider. No laws but the land's. No God but the hunger. Break the pact, and Ravenbrook dies with you." Behind them, the tree began to weep. Thick, dark sap that smelled like copper and decay. And from its hollow, something opened its eyes. The earth trembled beneath Elias's feet as the hollow tree split wider, its jagged maw stretching like a beast waking from centuries of slumber. The air thickened with the stench of wet soil and spoiled meat, and the whispers that had haunted Ravenbrook for generations now rose to a deafening chorus. Voices that were not voices, words that were not words, scraping against the mind like rusted nails. Elias clutched Eli against him, the boy's small body shivering with terror. Around them, the villagers had fallen to their knees, some weeping, others chanting in broken, hollow tones. Old Man Hargrove stood closest to the tree, his arms outstretched, his face alight with something between rapture and madness. "It's too late to stop it," Hargrove croaked. "The watchers are awake." From the depths of the hollow, something shifted, not the formless dark of before, but a presence, a vast, gnawing hunger given shape. Glimpses of it seared into Elias's vision. Too many limbs, too many eyes, a maw lined with shadows that were not shadows. It did not speak. It did not need to. Its desire poured into the world like a flood. It wanted out. Hargrove turned to Elias, his eyes gleaming with fervor. "Give the boy to the tree," he urged. "Finish the ritual. The watchers will take him and sleep again. The village lives. This is how it has always been." Eli whimpered, his fingers digging into Elias's coat. For a heartbeat, Elias hesitated. The weight of centuries pressed down on him. How many had stood where he stood now? How many had chosen to feed the darkness to save the light? Then he looked at the villagers, not at their fear, but at their resignation. Martha Holloway, her face streaked with tears. Jeb the barkeep, gripping a rusted pendant like a lifeline. They had been born into this nightmare. They had never been given a choice. Elias tightened his grip on Eli, and reached into his coat, not for his gun, for Thomas Holloway's journal. "No," he said, and his voice cut through the whispers like a knife. "This ends now." He flung the journal into the hollow. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then the pages began to blacken, the words Thomas had scrawled in terror igniting like kindling. The tree shuddered. The watchers screamed, a sound that was not sound, a pain that was not pain, but something deeper, older. The roots beneath their feet recoiled, the darkness writhing as if scalded. Hargrove howled in denial. "You fool! You've doomed us all!" The ground split, the tree groaned, and Elias knew with cold certainty that the choice had never been between sacrifice and salvation. It had been between fear and freedom. As the first rays of dawn pierced the canopy, the hollow tree erupted in flames, not the orange of earthly fire, but a searing, blinding white. The watchers twisted in the light, their forms unraveling like thread pulled from a loom. The villagers screamed, some in terror, some in something like relief. Elias held Eli close and ran. Behind them, Ravenbrook burned. Dawn crept over Ravenbrook like a thief, its pale light revealing a village forever changed. The hollow tree was now a smoldering husk, its once gnarled branches reduced to skeletal fingers clawing at the ashen sky. The air smelled of charred wood and something else, something clean, like the first breath after a storm. Elias Vane stood at the edge of the woods, Eli Carter still clinging to his side. The boy hadn't spoken since the fire, his wide eyes fixed on the ruins of the tree as if waiting for the shadows to return. Behind them, the villagers emerged from their homes like ghosts, their faces hollow with shock. Some wept openly, others simply stared, their expressions unreadable. Martha Holloway was the first to approach. Her hands trembled as she reached for Eli, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "It's over," she said. Elias wasn't sure if it was a question or a statement. He glanced at the tree, then at the villagers, their fear, their exhaustion, the dawning realization that the chains they'd worn for generations were finally broken. But freedom, it seemed, was not without its price. The fields lay barren, the crops withered overnight. The livestock had fled or died, their bodies stiff and cold. Even the river that had once cut through the village now ran black and sluggish, as if the land itself was mourning what had been lost. Old Man Hargrove sat alone in the ashes, his cane discarded beside him. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words only he could hear. When he looked up at Elias, there was no anger left in his eyes, only emptiness. "You've killed us," he whispered. Elias didn't answer. He knew the truth. Ravenbrook had been dying long before he arrived. The rot had just been hidden beneath the surface. As the sun rose higher, the villagers began to gather what little they could carry. Some would stay, stubborn as the stones of the church. Others would leave, seeking a life unshackled from the past. Elias watched them go, his own path uncertain. In his pocket, the small figurine he'd found in Thomas's house weighed heavier than it should have. He pulled it out, turning it over in his hands. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.